Hello everyone, welcome back. This is module 4 of Principles of Insurance and Risk Management. In our previous lecture, we learned how to quantify or how to measure risks of a single asset. In this lecture, we are covering diversification, risks and return. That means how diversification maximizes return for a given level of risks and minimizes risks for a given level of return. Now let's move to this lecture. So in reality, as the investor, we normally do not invest in a single asset, rather we invest in a portfolio. So what happens? We diversify our investment, and diversification has impact on both return and risks. Diversification helps to diversification helps to maximize return for a given level of risks. In the meantime, it also helps to minimize risks for a given level of return. So for the diversification of the portfolio, we need to know the correlation between asset, which simply measures the relationship between two variables or relationship between the returns of two assets. If returns of the assets are positively correlated, we can say that they will move in their return will move in the same direction. Now let's look at the example 1. So here, if we look at the example 1, return of asset A and return of asset B moves in the same direction. When return of asset A increases, return of asset B also increases. So by looking at this trend, we can say that these two assets are positively correlated. Now let's look at negatively correlated. In here, a series moves in opposite direction. That means the return of assets moves in opposite direction if they are negatively correlated. Now let's look at example 2. Here, when return of asset A decreases, return of asset B increases, and this trend continues. So we can say that returns of asset A and B are negatively correlated. And correlation coefficient is a measurement of correlation or degree of correlation. It ranges from +1 to -1. If it is +1, we'll say that it is perfectly positively correlated. Two assets are perfectly positively correlated. If it is -1, we'll say that two assets return are perfectly negatively correlated. Now diversification combines assets that have negative or low positive correlation to reduce overall risks of the investment. Keep in mind that if you build your portfolio with perfectly positive correlated or very high rate of positive correlation between two assets, this is not going to minimize risks. Your risks will be minimized if you add assets with negatively correlated or perfectly negatively correlated assets. So there might be some situation when you will find assets are uncorrelated. In this case, the assets will have no interaction between their return, and the correlation coefficient of uncorrelated asset is almost close to 0 or 0, simply 0. Now here is an example of diversification of two assets. So we are considering asset X and asset Y. Here is the historical rate of return of asset X and Y. So now let's look at the trends of asset X and asset Y. So in year 2003, for year 2003, return of asset X is 8%, whereas it is 16% for Y. In 2014, this is 10% for asset X and 14% for asset Y. Now if you look at the correlation between asset X and asset Y, you will see that when return of asset A X increases, return of X asset Y decreases. So by looking at this data, as it is only for 5 years, we can say that asset X and asset Y are perfectly negatively correlated. Now if you find out the average rate of return or expected rate of return for both assets, you will see that R bar for both assets is 12%. Now let's look at the portfolio return, calculate portfolio expected return and calculation of portfolio return. Now we assume that you will invest 50% of your money in asset X and 50% of your money in asset Y. So we are building a portfolio of 50-50. So 0.50 into 8% plus 0.50 into 60%, that's 12%. Similarly 0.50, that means we are investing 50% in asset X, 0.50 into 10% plus 0.50 into 14%, that's again 12%. So in this way we can calculate expected portfolio return from 2015 to 2017. So if we do the average of these returns, we'll find that expected rate of return of this portfolio, that means portfolio X and portfolio Y with 50-50 portfolio, is 12%. So now we are calculating the standard deviation of expected portfolio return. So if we use historical return, in this case the expected return will be simply the average. So that's the expected rate of return, expected portfolio return of the asset X and Y portfolio over the 5 years. So we are adding this 5 years return divided by 5, as there are 5 years. So 60% divided by 5%, that's 12%. And similarly there is a different formula for standard deviation if we use historical data. So that's R minus R bar square divided by N minus 1. N indicates number of periods. Here number of periods are 4, so 4 minus 1. So we know that the expected rate of return over the period where all are 12%, and that means the expected portfolio return over the years are 12%. It was 12% was the same over the 5 years, and expected value or average rate of return of the portfolio is also 12%. So if we calculate the standard deviation, 12% minus 12% to the power 2, that means square. So it will be the same for over the 5 years. Then 5 minus 1, that's 4. So 0% divided by 4, 0 divided by 4, and this standard deviation will be 0. As I have already said here that returns of asset X and returns of asset Y are perfectly negatively correlated. Their standard deviation is 0. So if you invest in this asset individually, you will say that their standard deviation is more than 0. But if you invest in a portfolio, that means if you invest in 50% in asset X and 50% in asset Y, the standard deviation of return will be 0%. So there will not be, theoretically there will not be any risks in this portfolio. So this is the concept of diversification. Instead of investing in one asset, we should find out asset that has really low correlation, and if we diversify, if we invest in our portfolio, we will be able to minimize risks without sacrificing return. So that's the concept of diversification, risks and return. So that's all about this lecture. In our next lecture we'll cover how to calculate return, standard deviation and coefficient of variation in Excel. So we'll show Excel calculation of return, standard deviation and coefficient of variation. In module 5, that's all about this module, or that means module 4. In module 5 we'll cover enterprise risk management and related topics. Thank you very much.